Hey, what's up? As a reviewer, I'm always looking for things that are better than good. I'm looking for real special items because most things these days are pretty good. And it's actually rare that I hit something that I feel like represents a bit of a paradigm shift, especially in the closed back space. It seems incredibly difficult to make a really technically great headphone. This is the SJY Horizon closed, and I think every company who is making a closed back should be paying very close attention to this headphone. This is made by one guy, and I'll have more to say about that in a little bit. For now, let's talk about the SJY Horizon and all the stuff that I think it's doing very well. So some quick disclaimers. I think that Oppos facilitated a unit to be sent to me from Jeff. I think that's kind of how this worked. But Oppos is who I was dealing with, and they sent it out. And if you want to buy this, you can find a link down below. It's about $100 off on the Oppos website. All right, thanks a lot. Here's the video. Now, the design itself is actually a little bit weird, but there's some pretty good reasons for why it's designed like this. One, you'll notice that the overall chassis shape is square. Now, inside that are these oval and angled forged carbon cups. And there's actually some pretty good reasons for this slight angle here. It's a little bit further out at the top and a little bit closer in at the bottom of this cup. Now from the outside, this is basically a completely symmetrical design, but if you open this up and look at the tuning paper, you can actually see that there is a bit of directionality here. And a last kind of odd benefit of this square design is this actually is basically its own headphone stand. It can just sit just like that. It's not gonna get knocked over. It's actually really stable. Even if the cups move around, it just kind of always stays standing. So it's kind of a side benefit of having the square design actually. Now the headband might actually seem pretty familiar. You may have seen this before on something called the DMS Omega project. And that's because Jeff, the owner of SJY, actually makes the headbands for Omega project. And that will pretty much lead me into the only two complaints that I really have for the build. One is the clamp force is a little bit light, just a hair. It just needs to be a little bit more. The second complaint is that these extension rods, I really wish were blacked out or maybe like a cool color. That would have been kind of nice to see because it doesn't really fit the theme, I don't think. To me, the overall build, when it showed up at first, I really wasn't sure about it. Just visually, I wasn't sure what to think. But after using it, the build is kind of growing on me, to be honest. And I start to see some of the advantages of doing it this way, especially being able to just set it down on a desk like a briefcase. It's kind of awesome, actually. So this thing takes absolute full advantage of being a closed back while mitigating and in some cases eliminating a lot of the downsides. This thing has some of the most neutral timbre I've ever heard out of a closed back and some of the absolute best bass I've ever heard out of any headphone. In fact, one of the crazy things about this headphone is the bass that you get out of this, I will confidently say is unobtainable for an open back headphone. There is no open back headphone that, in my opinion, gets even close. Not the LCD4, not the Empyrean 2, not the Empyrean Elite, not even the AB1266. There is no headphone that has this delivery for bass quite to the same level. This is equally as strong as it is clear. It's equally as powerful as it is subtle. It's just wonderfully tuned. And is a huge, massive upside to this headphone. In fact, the bass quality here is so good, not just compared to open back headphones, but this might just be the best bass I've heard on any headphone. It is exquisite, truly. So a couple characteristics. It is shockingly clear for how deep it gets. It doesn't seem to matter how hard you push the bass. There is always a level of transience where it's not blocking or bleeding into the other regions. And the handling of the mid bass here is really excellent for not just having a deep and full and kind of awesome sounding lower mid range, but the way that it transitions into the mid bass, it doesn't bleed at all, which is crazy. And that's before you even get into the sub bass, which has extremely good performance and the exact same properties. The sub bass doesn't feel like it's compromising anywhere else in the sound. And this is without EQ, and it's also without any sort of amplifier that leans into a warm tuning. I was perfectly happy using this on a Topping DX9, which is super neutral, and the bass is just absolute world-class, like master performance. It's just really, really good. But this headphone is also a good example of balance. See, as good as the bass is, it isn't overpowered. And it also isn't mismatched with the rest of the regions. Every region from mid-range, treble, and bass all have their own vivid and really unique properties. And I would say that the vast majority of this headphone across the board is actually generally really well proportioned. It's just that the bass is super high quality plus a little extra kick. This is the type of bass that I wish I could get on an open back headphone. I wish I could maintain the properties of being an open back headphone while getting these bass characteristics, but it just doesn't seem possible. There are a lot of really bassy open back headphones, but I feel like they're basically ruined or compromised in a lot of other areas of sound to get that bassy sound. This really doesn't feel like a compromise to me, which is really impressive. Okay, now there's sound staging. Now sound staging, in my opinion, is as good as a medium level open back headphone, which means it's great amongst closed back headphones. And even comparing to some of the best closed back headphones for sound staging, I actually think that this is better in a lot of other areas. For example, something like the HD820S, this doesn't soundstage quite as wide as that headphone does, but it doesn't have nearly the same dog shit tuning that the 820 has. So you end up benefiting so much from a kind of full and complete frequency response in ways that the 820S can really only dream of. And this also doesn't have any of that weird chambered echo effect that you can sometimes get on really wide soundstaging closed back headphones. And this actually kind of leads me into details and treble response and the finiteness of what you can get for sound out of this. See, remember these angled cups that we were talking about? Well, normally, I think that this is sort of like marketing fluff, right? Every company will tell you why its kind of design works really well. Like I remember on the HD820S, they were talking about the specific angle of the Gorilla Glass provided reflection properties that made it soundstage really wide. But I think that also kind of did a good job at ruining the rest of the headphone, to be honest. I think that this design, though, with this slight downward angle, is actually really smart because it affects the sound staging, but it also affects detail and fidelity everywhere else. So I think because it's doing a great job of mitigating and even eliminating a lot of the reflective properties, the sound in every region of sound, bass, mids, and treble, come across extremely clear. There's a distinct starting point and ending point, and you don't have reverb or echo or reflections kind of cutting through. Now, this actually ends up helping the soundstage a lot because it sounds clean on the open end. Like it sounds open-ended because things just stop. They don't kind of do this kind of bouncing thing where you're really noticing that you're hitting the barrier of a cup. So usually the way that I'm analyzing this stuff is I'm looking at the performance first, and then I analyze if the kind of the design is actually helping that or if it's just designed for the sake of design. And I think that this is definitely working. The performance is absolutely there to back it up. Now, regarding details and treble response, here's a couple comparisons. To other closed-back headphones that I like, you had the Focal Azurus. This is a much more detailed headphone in basically every capacity. This feels physically faster. This sounds quite a bit more detailed than that headphone does. And it really stands out in a way that I think differentiates the price quite noticeably. When it comes to some really high-end planar closed-back headphones like the Caldera Closed, that headphone does sound a little bit faster, but it's also over 3 times the price. And gets into ultra expensive headphone territory. And actually, as far as tuning goes, isn't nearly as complete. We'll talk about that in a little bit, actually. One of the things that makes this closed headphone stand out so much to me is actually that the details, the sound staging, and the rest of the frequency response is not only competitive with open back headphones, but in a lot of cases beats it. See, this is the part that I think a lot of companies need to learn from SJY. They're doing the balancing act of open back sound with closed back benefits super well. So some of the benefits that you can attain from closed back headphones is great bass quality. It's also, you get a lot of those hyper-focused small details coming through a little bit easier than some open back headphones. Not all, but some. And it's not only having all those benefits, but it's also somehow managing to make competitive, like almost open back sound for its frequency response in the mids and highs, and also its kind of open wide sound staging. So it's very impressive technically, and they're doing the balancing act super, super well. Now treble's really good, bass is really good, and I think mid-range, especially over some of its competitors, is a massive win. When you compare this to a headphone like the HD820S, the mid-range is just on another level. Like, it's even hard to explain the difference in mid-range if you don't hear the two, because you would think that the HD820S is like double the price. You would think that it's even remotely competitive, but it's truly not. This mid-range is super high quality, really neutral and very accurate sounding. Voices sound very realistic, and they don't really have a ton of negative properties either. Now, you may have some preferences here. For example, this isn't as sweet of vocals as something like the Bokeh. The Bokeh is a little bit smoother for a lot of the vocals, and it's even warmer when it gets into the lower mid-range in bass response than this headphone is, but this one I think is a bit more accurate. I think that's not the point of the Bokeh, but accuracy here is definitely the flavor of the mid-range. Now, there is a slight elevation as you get into the upper frequencies. Now, I don't want that to translate to this being a bright headphone, because it's definitely not. In fact, one of the areas that I look for and kind of have problems with a lot of closed back headphones is they seem to handle the sibilance region of sound, the S and T sound. A lot of them handle it very poorly, but shockingly, this glides right over that with zero issues. It is not a harsh sounding headphone in any capacity, yet it sounds really, really detailed, and that's not a balancing act that most headphones, even open ones, can do very often. Another area of just like supreme technical ability here is in its dynamic range through its bass, its mids, and its highs. This can really do whatever the music is asking it to do. If you have kind of a low underlying bass track that you don't really want super elevated in your music and washing out your vocalists, if that's what the music is doing, this will display that accurately. But if you have just crazy bass dynamics in a song, this will also display that accurately. So you have this good range, especially for bass. The dynamic range capability really reminds me of a really well-tuned IEM actually, where it seems like almost all the frequency areas are just like super well-tuned individually, and yet this is happening off of a single planar magnetic driver. So it's just shocking performance, to be honest. Now, as much as I like the sound of this, I don't really have any technical complaints for the sound. I think that certain people might prefer a much warmer headphone or a much brighter headphone or a more V-shaped headphone or a more mid-forward headphone, and that's up to personal preference. So I really don't have any complaints about its technical frequency response-based performance, or even things like its tonality or timbre, which I think are also extremely neutral and really great. The one complaint I do have about this, and you should really heed my words here and think about it and make sure you have the equipment to do this, this needs an absolute dump truck of power. This has an efficiency rating of 90 dB, and this is one of the only areas that I don't actually think that this extracts the value of being a closed back headphone. Typically closed back headphones, because they're closed, they can just operate a little bit more efficiently than their open back counterparts. This headphone is not the same. It's highly inefficient. This is probably the third hardest to drive headphone that I've used. There is the Modhouse Tungsten, the Susvara, and then the Carbon closed. So you need a really, really good amplifier to run this, and it will even benefit even more from a nicer amplifier than just a powerful one. So a couple recommendations for me would be something like an A90D amplifier, a Jotunheim, a DX9. These days, there's a ton of amps that actually have a lot of power, but they'll cost a fair bit. And you're definitely going to want to make sure that you have one of those to run this. This is unfortunately not something you'll be able to play off laptops or phones. Now, for a couple important comparisons here. You might notice that I'm not really bringing up major brands like Sennheiser, Focal, Fostex, brands that are kind of known for producing some closed back headphones, because I really don't think any of those major brands are all that competitive. In fact, the only brand that I really consider to be a strong competitor to this right now is ZMF. But it's also notable that I think the majority of ZMF's line is good at different things. I think they're for a different target market for different audiences. For example, this is most price competitive with the Bokeh, which is also one of my favorite headphones. But they're vastly different in terms of their performance capability. The Bokeh is not focused on being a technical performer. It's not focused on being flat. It's not focused on being neutral. It's a warm headphone, and that's its purpose, and it's very, very good at that. This headphone is actually a lot more comparable to the closed back Caldera from ZMF. Both are more in that neutral territory, but I actually think that this has some advantages over the Caldera, and I think the Caldera has some advantages over the Horizon. For example, the Caldera is simply a little bit more detailed, but it also costs a lot more, and that is something to really consider here. I think for the detail capability for its price range, it's actually one of the top players, but in terms of totality for headphones, there are a couple closed back headphones that beat it, the Caldera included. That being said, I think there's one major area where the Horizon does win, and that is going to be its bass capability. The Caldera is actually a little bit bass weak for a closed back headphone in my opinion. Both the Bokeh and the Horizon are much stronger. The Horizon is somewhere in between the delta between the Caldera and the Bokeh. The Bokeh is very strong for bass. It's definitely quite warm and a little bit more enhanced than I would consider to be accurate. It's good at that, but it is more enhanced. And the Caldera is actually quite a bit less than I would consider to be accurate, and sometimes it feels a little bit dry there. The Horizon is somewhere in the middle where it has better fidelity than the Bokeh, but also higher quantity than the Caldera, and that makes it in this really nice sweet spot for bass, and is an area where I consider the tuning to be a lot better than that of the Caldera, personally. Now, to be completely honest, I'm a little bit disappointed. Quite frankly, brands like Fostex, Focal, Sennheiser, they should all be doing better. This is one guy making a headphone that, quite frankly, just transcends the performance of 99% of the closed back headphones out there. And for that, I definitely think it's worth the price tag. But I can't help but feeling like these companies really should be taking notes, maybe even contracting this guy out to tune their headphones, because the sound quality here is legitimately just that much better than most of the crap that's out there for closed back headphones, and makes them not just good for closed headphones, but it's just a good headphone. So I don't want to be too frustrated here. I know that making a closed back headphone is hard, but some of these companies are also asking a lot more for worse performing headphones than what this is. And while this is certainly an expensive headphone itself, I'm just left a little bit disappointed. And I know that these companies can do better, and they definitely should be doing better in the future. But as far as the SJY goes, I know that it's quite expensive, but I would definitely keep it on your radar. Definitely consider the amplification requirements that this has. It really needs an amplifier, and it won't play off a laptop or a phone. Don't even bother trying. You just won't get enough volume out of it. That's the main issue. It sounds pretty good on most equipment, which is nice, that can run it, but it needs enough juice to actually get the volume up to normal listening levels. Okay, Oppos, thanks for sending this out. Jeff, you did a great job with this headphone. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.